This episode is brought to you by Microsoft Azure. Turn your ideas into reality with an Azure free account. Get everything you need to develop apps across cloud and hybrid environments, scale workloads, create cloud-connected mobile experiences, and so much more. Discover what you can create with popular services free for 12 months. Learn more at azure.com. That's AZURE.com. And sign up for a free account to start building in the cloud today.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Forget the frustration of picking commerce platforms when you switch your business to Shopify, the global commerce platform that supercharges your selling wherever you sell. With Shopify, you'll harness the same intuitive features, trusted apps, and powerful analytics used by the world's leading brands. Sign up today for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/tech, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/tech.
This episode is brought to you by Experian. Are you paying for subscriptions you don't use but can't find the time or energy to cancel them? Experian could cancel unwanted subscriptions for you, saving you an average of $270 per year and plenty of time. Download the Experian app. Results will vary. Not all subscriptions are eligible. Savings are not guaranteed. Paid membership with connected payment account required.
I'm Jason Pack, and this is Disorder, a show where we try to propose genuinely workable solutions that might, just maybe, create a semblance of order in our mad world. And Disorder is also a show where we're open to opposing viewpoints and very open to the possibility that technology could actually be used to improve health outcomes, decrease carbon emissions, and even generate economic growth. Therefore, despite my intrinsic AI skepticism and my deeply ingrained Luddite inclination, I am open to looking at things differently. I'm someone who intrinsically believes that governments should band together and regulate the shit out of AI, that we should impose penalties on countries like China that don't comply with whatever regulation we have, and we should consider blanket bans stopping AI's progress in its tracks. That said, I remain open to speaking to technical experts with far more in-the-weeds experience than myself. After all, I set out to make a podcast that was not just doom and gloom. I invested my time and my capital in this project because I was sick and tired of journalists and think tankers just reporting on and researching problems without proposing any solutions. So today we're going to look at AI a little differently than we did back in February on episode 25 with Miles Taylor. Could artificial intelligence-powered disinformation campaigns cause electoral mayhem? That was more of a doom and gloom episode, focused on the threats to our democracy from AI. Today, we're going to look at opportunities AI can afford democratic societies, trying to solve other governance challenges. And we're going to investigate if Britain could in fact be an AI superpower. Who better to go on this journey with than Marc Warner? Marc has written, AI Can Save Our Public Services. And he has called for government to commit to a 100-day plan, a framework to scale AI public service solutions, including a digital public assistant for every citizen, and a national policy twin to cut planning times. This is not small bore thinking. This is the kind of visionary mega-ordering type thinking that we heard from recently by Jamie Metzl. I'm excited to foreground this kind of big picture thinking on the Disorder program. So it's a real pleasure to introduce Marc Warner to all the mega orderers out there. Marc co-founded Faculty.AI to help organizations make better decisions using human-led AI. For over 10 years, he's worked with government agencies and leading brands to implement impactful AI solutions. He sat on the Prime Minister's AI Council, helped the NHS use AI to save thousands of lives during the pandemic, and attended the first ever AI Safety Summit. Marc, thanks for making the trip very far up north to Hampstead, and welcome to Disorder.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for bringing me over.
Marc, as anyone who's lived in the UK, even for a couple of years, would know, this country's government services are really in shambles. Waiting times for NHS appointments, delays to HS2, potholes in the road, horrific internet service, even in some of London's most economically important areas, and a UK diplomatic service that is understaffed, cutting far less of a figure on the world stage than it used to. How can AI help the British government deliver more value to Britons?
Well, AI on its own is not a complete panacea to all these problems. AI is not going to give you more nurses or doctors. It's not going to hire you more diplomats. However, it can be extremely effective in empowering those people to do their work more effectively. So let me give you one example. We work with a hospital trust in Wales where the big problem for the NHS at the moment is the backlog. But of course, part of the reason for the backlog is that patients get stuck inside hospitals. So depending on where you are in the country, somewhere between 15 and 30% of patients can be what they call medically optimized, as in fit and healthy to go out into the community, but are stuck in the hospital for a variety of reasons. Sometimes they're internal bureaucratic reasons. Often they don't have a place to go into social care available at the right time. The NHS is supposed to run at 85% capacity. That is it. At its peak, it's designed to run at that capacity. So the difference between where we are now at sort of high 90s percentage capacity and its optimal capacity could be entirely resolved by removing medically optimized patients, patients, from the system. That is the sort of problem that AI can help with, because it can empower nurses to do their jobs faster. It can predict when someone is likely to leave hospital and help the staff get the paperwork ready at the right time. Could even, in principle, help write a first draft of that paperwork. Could then connect that patient out into the right kind of social care bed and help nurses get people out into the community as fast as possible. So this is really good for the patients because it's actually quite dangerous to be in hospital if you're well. There's lots of sick people around and it's quite easy to catch infections. But it's also really good for the NHS because it's, the difference between them running at completely overwhelmed and their designed capacity.
For sure. There's bureaucracy, and AI could help optimize some of that bureaucracy. What about with things like potholes and roads and building infrastructure?
Yeah. So again, it doesn't intrinsically solve the problem immediately, but we've done quite a bit of work with organizations that want to make the best possible use of their maintenance crews. So in a bunch of circumstances, we've helped organizations who want to send gardening experts to the right place to strip away leaves to help railways run more effectively. We've helped them send gas maintenance providers like repairmen to the right houses to help them make more effective interventions there. So AI can't put tarmac in the hole right now, for sure, but it can make sure that all the background services run as efficiently as possible so that however much you're spending on repairing potholes, the maximum possible number of potholes get repaired for that.
So I think that's compelling because by not overpromising, you've said something that seems like AI could help with. In other words, optimization of existing resources. So while AI is delivering more value to Britons potentially in this optimization or cutting through the bureaucracy or allocating scarce resources kind of way, can Britain become an AI superpower more so than, say, some continental European countries or the US? And could this be a part of making Britain economically and politically more relevant in the world?
So I think it's hard to see a path to the UK being more relevant than the US or China. If we're take a very realistic look at what the kind of likely possible futures are over the next 5 to 10 years, in a world where tech giants are spending hundreds of billions, low hundreds of billions on chips to make AI supercomputers, that's significant fractions of the UK's government spending. And that, I think, is unrealistic to expect us to match. But outside of the US and China, we probably are the third most important AI power. We have a wonderful education system. We have Europe's most thriving startup scene.
English language.
With the English language.
The ability to attract foreign students, all
The
this stuff.
ability to attract foreign students. Very good visa laws for tech.
Connection to the subcontinent, where a lot of knowledge and skill power comes out of the subcontinent.
Correct. So, we should be looking to punch our weight as the kind of third AI power. And I do think that will have enormous consequences. Like, when I look at kind of UK GDP growth, which has been roughly flatlining since 2008, it seems critical that we get that sort of economic engine restarted. And the US has primarily done it through the growth of their tech companies. AI is a wonderful opportunity. It's sort of a step change. And so that will offer a bunch of new opportunities to people. And hopefully the UK can see some of those.
Amazing. Before we get into the private sector, which I see no reason it shouldn't be more vibrant than it is here, let's talk a little bit more about the public sector. So you co-wrote the preface for a paper with Tony Blair, and that paper is entitled Governing in the Age of AI, a New Model to Transform the State. That title really resonated with me, Marc, as does this quote from the paper. You called to, quote, set up a new expert AI operation in number 10 to join up existing teams, an AI mission control headed by a dynamic AI mission CEO with a strong mandate to drive change. That's exciting. That's the kind of stuff that gets me up in the morning. Tell us, I want to order the disorder. How would this work in practice?
Well, I mean, it depends what elements you're kind of interested in. So number 10 is roughly the center of the change mandate in the UK system, maybe Cabinet Office as well, a little bit. And so having the personal connection to the Prime Minister enables you to get a lot done inside the UK systems. There are already brilliant teams in there. So there's a thing called 10DS, which is like the number 10 data science unit, which is doing brilliant work, and another thing called X.AI, which is a sort of almost SWAT team that can go across departments and help them implement cool, interesting, important AI projects. And really, in some sense, we're suggesting supercharging those. So taking the already existing really brilliant work that's being done and lifting it to another level of both support and impact.
Great. So as we're talking, Sir Keir is in his first 100 days. He's come into power. He has a mandate. He can do things. How could he create this AI mission control at the heart of government? And has he spoken, obviously this isn't in the manifesto because the manifesto was so vague, but has he spoken off the record or in other forums about doing something like your AI mission CEO?
So I don't think I have seen quotes from him directly about AI, but there are certainly other people in the Labour Party, Peter Kyle particularly, who are very thoughtful on this and have spoken about it publicly. The bottleneck to doing many things inside UK government is that it's actually quite hard to hire people. There are a bunch of rules around how hiring has to be done that put reasonably long time frames on getting good people in. And there's a bunch of restrictions around salary that mean it's quite hard to pay people equivalent to the private sector. So really, if you actually wanted to implement something like this, you'd have to find a way to carve it out from those two elements of the bureaucracy such that it could hire in the talent that it needed at the salaries that they would require to work there and start executing. Now, we know that's possible because the UK has this AI Safety Institute, which is basically the best technical team, maybe in the kind of anywhere that I've met in the sort of public parts of government. And they have managed to bring those people in. So it's certainly possible, but it probably requires some focused attention. I think perhaps the interesting question on top of that are where are the like really critical challenges that this team could be used for? And obviously, we know that in healthcare, there are just so many opportunities to use AI, both on the diagnostic side and the operational side.
So let me toss one out that maybe Britain could do differently than the US and China. Here, there is a largely centralized government healthcare system, and it doesn't have all these different HMOs and state mandates and all that other crap. So yes, it may be a little bit on its knees now because it's operating at 95 or 100% capacity and it wants to be at 80% capacity. But if a sweet spot was hit, is it possible because the NHS has scale in a way that, say, the Irish healthcare system or the Swiss healthcare system doesn't? It has enough scale but enough centralization that you could roll out one of these things?
The NHS is still quite a complicated system. Although in comparison to the US, it's obviously simpler in some ways. It is still a million-person bureaucracy with a sort of mixed level of independence for the trusts and the central NHS, which is all separate from the Department of Health.
But can't that be redone?
In principle, it could be. In practice, it's extremely complicated, and there's like lots of challenges that government would face in trying to intervene to change these things. So the starting point, the slightly depressing starting point, is quite hard. But you are also right, there are phenomenal opportunities there, like the genomic sequencing database that the UK has, UK Biobank and Genomics England, are still some of the world's leading full sequence data sets for genomics. Not that this is my expertise, but I understand from experts. And so when the UK sets its mind to something, the like opportunities available with the NHS are powerful, but it shouldn't be thought of as a no-brainer. If you really wanted to intervene in that system, there's lots and lots of thinking that has to be done about how to make the different parts work effectively together.
For sure. I thought the way this conversation was going to go is that I was going to be the pessimist and you were going to be the optimist telling me about all these things that could be done easily. But I think that the UK system of healthcare, because of its relative centralization and it being in a bit of trouble financially now, presents a great opportunity case. Because Starmer has come in with this mandate. The people demand more than just these 40,000 more appointments per week. It's this. In other words, that's such a low target that he set. Yeah. He's got to do something which is ambitious. And because he is a centrist or on the right of the Labour Party, it's not like he's going to privatize these things. He can centralize them, but he also wants to bring in the expertise from the private sector because he's not on the extreme left of the Labour Party. He wants to, use technology and use things for the private sector. So I can understand that it may not happen, but I do think it could happen. So let's pivot from the UK to talk about the US a little bit. Obviously, AI as a domain and discipline emerged from the US, and it emerged from the Silicon Valley plus New York hedge fund milieu. What has the Biden administration done to capitalize on all of that expertise in California and New York and Maryland and Virginia to upgrade American government procedures on AI? I haven't seen it.
There's small examples. So one, I think, nice example from California is using AI to scan video feeds from mountaintop cameras to detect wildfires. And obviously, over the last decade or so, they've had enormous, that's a very, very valuable problem that AI could help with. That is the type of problem that AI is going to turn out to be a no-brainer success for. AI is extremely good at image analysis. Cameras can be very cheap. It is totally plausible that if you committed to building a significant network of cameras to monitor for fire across California, you could do a very good job of that very cheaply. So I try not to be unduly optimistic or pessimistic. I always want to be realistic about these things. That one is a no-brainer hit. That in 10 years' time, it will seem crazy that we had to have people up there spotting for
100%. Then it makes me only think, is it going to be Greece or is it going to be the US that does that first? Obviously, there are these Greek wildfires, but sometimes there's an advantage of being small. And we have investigated a lot on this program, the advantages that small states have. So if we look back at our episode 36 and 37 with the former president of Armenia, Armen Sarkisian, he explained that there's stuff that Singapore and Estonia and Ireland are doing, which is just like way ahead of stuff that the US and the UK are doing. And so I have a worry, which is that somehow big governments with these like very entrenched rules and regulations are not going to be able to do this. But smaller countries where they're just going to be like, well, we just changed the regulation. How do you see this problem?
I think of it in terms of agility and scale. And there's like advantages to agility and advantages to scale. And the crucial thing is for countries to play to their advantages. And so, you know, the fact that the US has such an enormous market means that lots and lots of tech companies can grow to scale very locally in roughly one single ecosystem.
Right, but that's a private sector issue.
Yes. Now, totally true, but the spillover consequences for that for the public sector are that as far as the future of AI goes, it looks like it's going to be basically controlled by American companies, which will sit in American legal structures, which will be under the control of American politicians. That's a very powerful thing.
And this is a critical thing, of course, that just like with the SWIFT code system, whereby U.S. sanctions and U.S. rules are really able to affect Russian banks, we created a system for how money is transferred that allows the Department of the Treasury to level sanctions in a way that really matters. And now we have secondary sanctions, which are those on firms that work with Russian firms. So I could see that in the AI sector, because of having so many AI firms in roughly put California, then the U.S. regulatory authorities are going to be able to have sanctions in effect on people who work with those firms, and it could be very, very powerful. But that's on the regulatory side. I'm still interested in the implementing side. In other words, how can we implement some of those, you know, taking the skills and the tech that California has created and use it so that DOD can help the Ukrainians defeat Russia, so that DOD can understand how it can have better drone technology to shoot down Iranian drones, that kind of stuff.
So I think that is where scale starts to play against you. So it can be genuinely hard to move an entire system. That being said, at least on the defense side, American defense spending is so large that there are pots of money inside DOD that individuals control that are like bigger than the entire, this isn't quite factually true, but bigger than the entire spending of somebody like Ireland or Estonia or whatever. And so I think in defense, America is going to drive a bunch of the future of the technology. But I think you're right. And
I think it's critical to point out that in early computing, even before DARPA and the DARPANet, I'm talking about the Fairchild semiconductor days, it was American defense contracts that drove essentially the invention of the microprocessor. It is the U.S. defense industry that was at time in Vietnam single-handedly leading to the creation of precision-guided munitions and the chips that could control them. So I completely believe you that if we had those right people at the DASD level directing those pots of money, it could be amazing in what could be produced.
Totally agreed. But then moving away from defense slightly, it is perhaps slightly harder to see how America would necessarily drive AI in the public sector, just because you guys don't have the same like public services that we do. So in healthcare, it will come via the private sector, you know, where we might use it for public transportation and trying to make our services here more efficient. That'll be hard to, like, you know, the same infrastructure.
And this is really exciting because it means a UK or a Scandinavian country, if it wants to really be cutting edge, they can leverage the existence of public transport networks or public healthcare, and then the interface of that with AI. So I think that that's something exciting we're going to return to on this podcast. I want to push you a little bit on the question of disruption. Some people have said that Starmer's centrism can't be bold enough to embrace or implement the kind of vision that you're talking about, that you need to be more of a disruptor. I don't feel that. You know what I mean? I'm a radical centrist, and I always want to remind people that when Clemenceau was in power, he was in power on behalf of the Radical Party in France in the pre-World War I period. And what was radical about Clemenceau's party? It was radically in the center, right? So I don't see why you can't do this stuff from the center. But am I missing something? Do you need to be more of a disruptor given the forces that are just so rigid and don't want this to happen?
I do think that if you take any large bureaucracy, whether it's public sector or private sector, a giant multinational company or a large government department, both are large bureaucracies. And one of the things that if you work with them for a while, you'll find is that bureaucracies are, because of the thousands and thousands of separate interactions that have been kind of created and guided over time to do a specific thing, effectively defend that specific thing. So you should think of them as like defenders of the status quo. If you want to change that, you do need some kind of mandate for it. And if you're an incoming CEO into a large multinational organization, it'll always be helpful if it's facing some kind of crisis that enables you to really move things forward.
Yeah, and no crisis is too big to waste.
Exactly the root of that kind of expression. Now, being very on the outside of politics, nevertheless, I think it's going to be hard, even if Starmer is radically centrist, given the fact that there hasn't been a great deal of laying out of his policies in the manifesto. It'll be hard to drive that change through big bureaucracies. That's not to say it's impossible, but just knowing what I do about organizations rather than necessarily politics, my claim is that this is going to be like a tricky thing. But I'm excited. I want him to do it. So
100%. And I agree in seeing those hurdles, and I agree in wanting it to happen. So to what extent were the Dominic Cummings and Steve Bannons of the world correct that the government institutions circa 2016 were so broken that they can't be rebuilt as currently configured and need to be torn down and rebuilt, the demolish and rebuild? I'm of two minds on this question. And given the proximity that you've been to some of these things, I'd love to know your thoughts.
So, I don't think that you can make blanket statements about all institutions. So I wouldn't like to just say blanketly, all organizations need to be torn down or all organizations need to be kept running. I think COVID showed to many people that a lot of our institutions are less than capable or less capable than we'd like of dealing with very fast-moving crises. That sort of demonstrated that we should be looking to make the institutions better. How do you do that? I do think the reason we see startups succeed against incumbents is because it's often easier to build something afresh than it is to change.
This is exactly what I was trying to get at.
And so if a particular organization, if we looked at it and decided this feels really unhealthy, really, really unhealthy, I think there would be a sensible claim to say, well, in the private sector, they call this the champion-challenger model. So you give a small set of people an opportunity for a year to try and build up a new reconfigured way of executing the same services as the champion. So the champion is the existing version. The challenger is a new kind of startup that you create inside the organization. And after a year, you compare the performance of the two. And if the challenger fails, you just keep going with the champion. If the challenger succeeds, you kind of shift over to the challenger model. And so, I think of something like that as a way of threading the needle between, you can't just turn off government services, you can't turn off benefits or whatever for 6 months while you rebuild it over here. But if you run this kind of champion-challenger model in parallel, it'll look like you're spending a bit more on it in the short term, but the long-term benefits will just vastly dwarf the short term. After the break, we're going to get into the nitty-gritty, a bit of how
AI can work together with public services. Mega orderers, wanted to tell you guys about another podcast that I really like, The Jordan Harbinger Show. We're really fortunate to have Jordan as a guest later this year. He is a superstar. His show features in-depth interviews with some of the world's most fascinating minds. And what Jordan brings to the pod is a cool, calm Californian energy, talking about tech regulation, but then also relationships and some self-help advice. He also speaks with some of the most fascinating minds out there, like Jamie Metzel and Bill Browder. It's really a must listen for any of you mega orderers out there. Search for The Jordan Harbinger Show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Welcome back, orderers. So, I am really fortunate to be here with Marc Warner. He wrote with Tony Blair, and I quote, "And when both of us survey the operations of governments from our different perspectives, we see the same opportunity. Almost everywhere, AI can help us reimagine the state. Many of the countless daily tasks in government are repeatable processes carried out on a mass scale. Almost all of these can be made better, faster, and cheaper. As this paper lays out, the scale of this opportunity is huge. With the technologies and the digital infrastructure we have today, we estimate that up to 40 billion can be saved each year with the technology as it exists now. But of course, over time, this technology will accelerate dramatically in its capability, and so will the savings. At a time when government is unwieldy, expensive, and slow, AI can save our public services, making them more personalized and human-centric." I love that word human-centric, but I'll believe it when I see it. Get into the nitty-gritty. How is AI going to ever make something more human-centric rather than computer-centric?
So I think it's a design choice. At Faculty, we've spent 10 years building AI systems. And in a world where you don't have human-level artificial general intelligence, the best decisions are going to be made by people and machines working together. Now, actually, lots of ways that AI systems are built doesn't factor in that there's going to be a human user a lot working alongside the AI in some regard or other. It doesn't have to be, take silly example of executing ad buying decisions in some kind of digital marketplace. Obviously, a human is never going to get involved in that, or financial transactions at a detailed level. But they're still going to want to understand what the model's doing. They're still going to want to understand the strategy. They're going to want to set bounds. They're going to want to govern it, and all those good things. And so actually what needs to happen, and what will ultimately end up happening, because the market will ask for it, is that we're going to build a much better class of AI systems that are safer, more powerful, and more human-centric. There's a bunch of underlying design choices and technology choices that need to be made to get us to that point. And in some sense, that's what Faculty specializes in.
You're bringing a huge amount more expertise to this question than I have, but let me tell you my nightmare here. What I have experienced with public services in the UK is that they are not human-centric enough. So, for example, I'm dealing with Barnet Council, where I've bought a house, and it turns out that I shouldn't have to pay council tax when my house was uninhabitable, when there was no electricity and plumbing and it was ripped up. So I called Barnet Council, and this is a real story, and they're like, "Oh, yeah, we don't assess that anymore. It's the valuation office." You write the valuation office. And then they're like, "Oh, no, we can't assess that. We need these things from Barnet." And I'm like, "No, but they just said that they needed it from you." And then they're like, "Fill out this online form. We're going to get back to you in 3 months." I filled out the form, and then they just write me a form letter. And the form letter says, "Do you not have a roof?" And I'm like, "No, that wasn't the issue that I submitted." And then you get the employee on the phone. You're like, "But I just want to speak to the manager." And they're like, "Well, my manager has no power to take this decision. You've got to go to this thing." So what I see is that computers have taken away the agency from people to just say, great, you've demonstrated that you didn't live in this house for the 6 months that you owned it. You don't have to pay. But now my fear of AI is that the human employees won't be able to just overrule the AI. I give another example because my podcast listeners love hearing about my inability to get car insurance in the UK.
I heard about it.
So I have a car, which you saw out of my driveway as you came here, and it's not the car I wanted to buy. It's just the only car I could get insurance for. I actually was proposed 3 or 4 other cars, but when you put in their license plate numbers, which is in the UK called the registration, into any of the insurer's systems, they say, oh, there is no such car. Yes, it's registered with the DVLA, but we don't have the make and the model. We don't have that it's an Opel. We don't have this. So we can't insure it if it doesn't come up in the system. If they could type in the car, the make, the model, the automatic, the left-hand drive, whatever, they could insure it. But if it doesn't come up in their system, they can't. And you say, well, I want to speak to the manager. And the manager is like, I'm sorry, it's not coming. We can't insure this car because it's not coming up in the system. And the reason for this is that no manager can overrule, because when they put in the registration plate, it doesn't come up. My fear is that once we have the AIs, that AIs are not going to be able to handle left-hand drive cars, and no human is going to be able to overrule the system, and then no one is going to be able to get this insurance. So talk me through how what I experienced with Barnett and with these insurers isn't going to just happen on a colossally larger scale.
So, I think the first thing to understand is how much of those were actually driven by computers. The first example you gave, I think there's a set of bureaucratic rules there that probably aren't even being driven by computers. I would claim that there is a bureaucratization in the West where we're trying to replace skilled people with small, concrete rules and less skilled people to drive costs down that lead to this kind of thing. Computers are only a small part of that particular, your first example. In the second example, that does feel more directly related to computers. But in some ways, you can point to that as an example of a situation where computers as they're currently built, as the software is currently built, aren't serving us. If I was to ask you, what actually would you like from your computer system in that world? You want a bit more flexibility and a bit more intelligence, right? That's the promise of AI. AI can bring those. That won't be perfect. It will come with some problems of its own. But often moving things into maths, moving things into computer programs means that we can correct them faster if the systems are set up to allow us to do that.
But I want that the human underwriter or the manager can be like, sure, the car costs X amount. We get that it's this brand. Great, the insurance is $2,000. Do you know what I mean? And apparently the way these things have played out is they're like, I have no authority to do that. If it doesn't come up in the system, I can't set the price. And this is something which I find extremely interesting because it seems to be further along in the UK than the US. So that if they're
I agree with that.
If they're like, you know what, your electricity thing is this, and then they can't do anything to get around that.
But I noticed that, when did I come back? So I lived in the US for 3 or 4 years in 2010, 11 to about 2015. And one of the most striking things to me in going there was that irrelevant of the computer systems, if you walked into a 7-Eleven and just said to the assistant behind the counter, I think this thing is should be done differently, they'd kind of look at you, make their own judgment, and if they thought it should be done differently, they'd just do it differently. That felt like a very strong cultural difference between the US and the UK.
Yep. Now let's pivot to the broader economy. Since the financial crisis of 2008, economic growth in the West has largely stalled and productivity outside of the United States has flatlined. Could you sketch the connections for us between the lack of productivity growth across the West, especially in comparison to places like China and India, and the rise of neopopulism and the global disorder we see today?
My rough model of this is in a world where people are looking at their kids and thinking, for the first time ever, a generation is going to grow up poorer than their parents. I think it's no surprise that people are looking at the systems that are supposed to provide these opportunities for us and asking why are they not doing that. And I think we're seeing different reactions across the world. Different cultural circumstances lead to different solutions to those problems. But I think of it as, my simple political understanding thinks of it roughly as this kind of economic question, that if the systems that are in hand can't provide good futures for the citizens that they're supposed to be doing that for, you will intrinsically end up with this, correctly really, citizens asking for new options.
Yes, and of course, if you look at the Weimar Republic, the problem with it primarily is that it had hyperinflation. It wasn't Weimar that caused the hyperinflation. It was the Treaty of Versailles, the world situation, the Depression, which was not caused by Germany, but pretty much Anglo-American stock speculation. But Weimar happened to be sitting in the position that it was. And then because it wasn't able to deliver those outcomes, it led to traditional populism. So that's a very compelling answer. But people associate this era of big tech with feeling left behind. Even if the big tech didn't cause them to be left behind, how can big tech help people feel less left behind if we solve some of these AI things? Aren't they just going to feel more distanced from the mode of production?
I think it depends. So it's clearly true that a lot of the growth that's come, even in the US, so actually when you said the West has stopped growing, I think that's true of basically everything except the US, which is still doing pretty well. And it seems, my understanding is that the US growth comes primarily from the tech companies. And so I do think that intrinsically tech succeeds because it's a very scalable infrastructure that can be used globally and provided by a few thousand people in California. That leads to these unequal returns and a small set of people getting very rich and a wider set of people having less opportunity. And so my rough understanding of the UK, for instance, is many parts of our productivity in different elements of our country were sort of flatlining or decaying, but those were roughly hidden by kind of success of the financial sector up to 2008. And the financial crash and the regulations afterwards meant that this kind of flatlining productivity was now revealed. It was both true in the finance industry and all the other industries that had been kind of slightly hidden because of the growth of finance. And so the UK seems to me to face a question of where we're going to get that growth from. And, if we could invent some new place to get that growth, that would be excellent. But if we want to look to what's going on in the world today, we have to assume a decent chunk of it is going to come from technology. And so I think we have to find ways to create a tech industry in the UK, create at least some tech champions, and then the benefits that flow from that, the tax revenues, whether it's the corporation tax or the income taxes, then have to be redistributed. I don't see a path to kind of rolling back and having less mechanized agriculture or something like that would have been the source of, many, many jobs at the turn of the 20th century.
We want to order the disorder here at the Disorder Program. I really value your, expertise and experience. Tell us the kinds of things that we should be concerned about from a safety perspective.
So narrow artificial intelligence should not worry anyone. The consequences of it working badly can be bad. So if a kind of algorithm in a medical context were to turn out to not be very effective, that could be bad. But there's very little about the AI that can become fundamentally dangerous on a different level. However, general artificial intelligence, so a single algorithm geared at solving every task, is unlike any technology we've ever seen in history. It, in principle, will strictly dominate humanity on its most important characteristic, on our kind of the intelligence that has set us apart from all the other animals on the planet. And so when you reason from historical analogy, when you say, well, the plow disrupted some farmers but was a net good, or the telephone or the internet disrupted some set of people but it was a net good, you're always looking at technologies that took some like small aspect of what humanity was capable of and basically superseded us in our ability to do that thing. But those were actually relatively marginal characteristics. We already, when the internal combustion engine came around, we already weren't the like best source of horsepower. It was already horses. We already weren't the fastest animals on the planet. Like, these weren't ever attributes that we were at the top of the spectrum on. The difference with a true general artificial intelligence that's human or superhuman level is that it's a unique moment in human history, and it can't be reasoned about from an analogy very easily. Now, that's not to say intrinsically it will be utterly terrible and devastating, or intrinsically it will solve every problem and, be kind of somewhat utopian. I think there are arguments for both, and there's a lot of uncertainty, even by the people who are at the like total cutting edge of these fields, around what the kind of outcomes of that would look like. But it's so significant, I think we have to approach it with caution. And so the types of safety work that I want to see are, on the one hand, making sure that our narrow AI systems are really good at doing the specific jobs that we want for them. So if you're doing breast cancer screening with AI, it's got to be really, really good at breast cancer screening. And so that kind of safety, I think, is really important. But then there's understanding these like totally cutting edge, very general models, and understanding what capabilities we can have and how we can make them, put bounds around them to ensure that they can't get out of control. And I think that is another element of safety that's like it's a different category, but it's totally crucial as well.
Marc, you've done a really great job of laying out for the listeners the ways in which general AI is new, and it proposes new challenges and new opportunities. What kind of institutions do we need to handle these new challenges?
My personal take is that we should learn some of the lessons from the private sector. In the private sector, we've seen organizations like Amazon embrace what they call single-threaded leadership, which is really about returning accountability to individuals. And I would like to see smaller, more nimble organizations with more direct accountability that I think can move faster in response to the challenges that we face, more complicated world.
I'm all about accountability. But if you were global orderer-in-chief for a day and you could create 2 global coordination institutions, one to harness AI for economic growth and betterment of society, and another to regulate AI, how would these 2 associations look like? How would they function?
I'd probably put them together. So for me, the build up to artificial general intelligence and then beyond to sort of superintelligence is one of the great challenges that humanity is ever going to face. And we should do it carefully. And one of the problems that we face in the world today is that lots of different organizations, whether private or public sector, are going to be racing towards that outcome as fast as they can. And so in a totally hypothetical world where I could really sort of enforce compliance to an AI project that was run by somebody who could do it slowly and sort of reverentially in a way that maximized the opportunities for the upside, but also mitigated the potential risks, I think that would be a very, very powerful thing. The problem is I just don't really see that in the kind of multipolar world that we live in right now.
Because the Chinese are going to be competing, and therefore if we slow down to have the right standards, and if we slow down and have the right protections, they're going to try to race ahead. So what can we do to mitigate that?
The upside here is that nobody wants to destroy the world. And I don't think this should just become about China and US. It's also public and private sector. Most of the cutting edge work is going on inside the private sector. And so hopefully, in the same way that in the Cold War, we managed to do some amount of back channeling around particular critical elements, let's say nuclear, and perhaps less successfully around other weapons of mass destruction, I'd like to see, and even in a world of greater polarization, I'd like to see people talking about these kind of crucial issues of general AI safety, because that's much more of a question of us as a species rather than us as a nation.
For sure. And this gets at the point that we've covered in many episodes, which is that talking is actually doing. And one of the things that NATO does is it's a forum for people to just talk it out. NATO can't force the member countries to do anything. But the mere fact that they meet in Brussels or at the summit in Washington and that they have to do some planning, even if they can't force the countries to implement the plans, that has a benefit. So maybe having an association with different stakeholders, of whom some will be private sector, some will be public sector, even if it can't impose solutions on people, just doing that planning could be useful?
I think so. And in some ways, that was exactly, presumably, the thesis behind the Bletchley AI Safety Summit, where the UK government brought together a bunch of countries and a bunch of private sector organizations. The countries signed this Bletchley Declaration, which is a non-binding declaration saying that we are all together in this problem and we all care about safety. And I agree with you. I think that's a very good indicator. And it has to be built upon. It has to be grown. It has to have meaning in the world. But it's a great starting point.
Can Britain find a unique role as an AI superpower, just as it could be a climate superpower? I mean, I not only moved here because I have friends here and I went to graduate school here. I see so much potential for this country. I mean, the triangle between Oxford, Cambridge, and London when it comes to knowledge and things like publishing and linguistic expertise and attracting people from the Middle East and Eastern Europe and various backgrounds. I see lots of opportunities. I am not knowledgeable enough about AI to postulate that Britain could be an AI superpower. I'm sure it can be a climate superpower. When it comes to AI, talk me through it. Could the synergies that we talked about of having public transportation and the NHS work with the information ecosystem here to create something new and different that can't happen elsewhere and then, generate value that can be copied elsewhere?
Yes, it definitely can. I think probably the sort of largest advantage at the moment. So there's the US, which I think is hard to imagine us exceeding nowadays. There's China, which is sort of a separate ecosystem. The closest competitors to the UK are really other Western European countries. And they are getting in some confusing places with the EU AI Act, or people tell me that they're finding it difficult to really understand what's going to happen there. And it seems like the course of the EU is towards regulating AI more and more strictly. That makes it hard for both AI startups to base themselves there. It also makes it hard for large US tech companies to base their AI efforts there. And so I think the UK, as a genuinely expert party between these three poles of the US, China, and the EU, can use its agility to seize opportunities that these larger blocks won't be able to. And in particular, with respect to the EU, I think we'll have a sensible regulatory advantage where we're relatively focused on making sure domain-specific narrow systems don't do any harm, but they're managed per domain. So your medical algorithm has really strict regulations around it, but perhaps your marketing algorithm doesn't. That seems very sensible to me. And then we're also world leading in investigating the capabilities of these general algorithms through the sort of AI Safety Institute. So really, we're staking out an interesting place for ourselves in this world, and we just need to seize the opportunities, and that's kind of what I hope this new government will do.
From your mouth to God's ears, Marc. Thank you for helping explain these really complex and important topics to the mega orderers out there.
Thank you so much for having me.
If you enjoyed today's show, please tap follow so you can get all our new episodes when they dropped. Marc has written lots of interesting things and given talks elsewhere. So if you want to follow the links in the show notes to get his thoughts about AI more generally, or where we're at in terms of the growth of AI and its regulation, you can subscribe to the Substack, where I'm going to write about this, and follow the other links in our show notes. As always, Disorder is produced by George McDonough, and our executive producer is Neil Fern. We hope you have a very orderly and AI-safe week.